the Labour Party seemed to me to have been very clear
Yeah.
with President Zelensky that a steadfast approach to Ukraine and support for Ukraine is absolutely at the top of their agenda. And again, they've written, above all else, standing by Ukraine is important to them. And whereas everyone wants to see an end to this conflict, I don't think there's a cigarette paper between the Labour Party's policy in standing absolutely steadfast with Ukraine and not giving the impression that there's any weakness or wavering there, and giving full support to President Zelensky in the belief that that is the best way to bring this to an end, by showing the resolution of the West, and that President Putin cannot break that down.
Let's talk about foreign policy. It's one of the big files in the government's in tray, and the situations in Gaza and Ukraine are going to dominate some thinking. How best might these be approached? Well, let's talk to Alistair Burt, former Conservative MP and former Foreign Minister. Alistair, hello again.
Hello, Henry. How are you?
I'm really well. I mean, as I
What
was
a
saying,
24 hours, eh?
well,
Wow.
I'm not one of those people who's been doing one of those masochism shifts. I did get some sleep, and I got up bright and early, and followed the slings and arrows of outrageous political fortune. Let me call it that. All right. So maybe we should start off with Gaza, because the Labour Party, it took some time, but then it called for a ceasefire, putting some clear red water, you might say, between itself and the now former government. How far do you think its approach should differ from the approach of the former Conservative government?
I think Gaza probably poses perhaps the biggest foreign policy test in a way for the new government. The conventional thinking is that by and large, the new government's approach to foreign affairs is going to be very similar to that of the previous government. And that's because UK interests are UK interests. They're not partisan or anything like that. Relationships with the United States, we know there must be an improved relationship with Europe, keeping an eye on those states that threaten the United Kingdom, China and Russia. That's going to be no different. Gaza poses particular problems. Firstly, the conflict that goes on is clearly, it's atrocious. We see it every day, and it has huge impact. But I think David Lammy and the Labour Party are conscious that the UK's position has been damaging to the way in which the United Kingdom is seen by many around the world, particularly the global south, and issues of double standards and the like. And it's an area where the Conservative government has placed its alliance with Israel and its horror at the outrage of October the 7th at the top of the agenda, and seemingly has done so.
Would you say the former government was wrong to do that?
No.
Or wrong to do that for so long?
No, I don't think it was wrong to do that. It was right to recognise the atrocity of October the 7th. But the longer the reprisal went on, the more the balance shifted, and it became impossible to justify everything that was being done in terms of reprisal simply on what had happened on October the 7th. But David Cameron, I think, began to do so. The rhetoric changed, and he began to make the case, which is the right case in my view to make, that one does not justify the other. October the 7th was unjustifiable, but actions that Israel has taken in many cases in relation to civilians is equally unjustifiable. And you can believe both in trying to find a reasonable settlement. Now, the extra pressure that the Labour Party has clearly is reflected in the issue of votes that we have seen from some areas of the country that the Labour Party would regard as being more likely to support them, but the Muslim community has found it very difficult to do so. And we've seen that with the election of independent candidates and pressure on the Labour Party. So I think one of the first tests that the government will have is what are they going to do, and how are they going to move forward on delivering that sense of what the United Kingdom can do to play a part in the ceasefire that's necessary and the wider solution that is necessary to resolve the issues of West Bank, East Jerusalem and Gaza.
Mm-hmm. I mean, often when politicians are stuck, they've got a really difficult conundrum, they resort back to their values. I remember the late Foreign Secretary Robin Cook talking about an ethical dimension to our foreign policy. How useful might that be as a compass with which to guide the new government's attitude towards relations with Netanyahu and the current Israeli government on this very difficult area?
Well, David Lammy has helpfully set part of this out. He wrote a thoughtful article in the international journal Foreign Affairs just last month, like everyone else, presumably anticipating that he had a further few months to develop policy and everything else. But he talked about something he described as progressive realism. And he was careful to distinguish between an idealism founded on a lack of realism, which is not a foreign policy, but recognized you had to see the world as it was, but it didn't mean that you need to neglect values. He said in one of his sentences, governments do not have to choose between values and interests. And I think what I would expect him to do was try and create a situation where British foreign policy recognised the values, international law, adherence to international law, and aligned that to the interests of the United Kingdom, because in being seen to stand up for international law and being prepared to apply it in conflict situations, Britain's prestige in relation to states that worry that we seem to have a different attitude to Ukraine, to say Gaza, trying to close that gap. So I think that's where he says himself that he's clear-eyed and realistic about the world, and that means that ethics and values are of huge importance, but you have to see the world as it is, and you may have to work with some of those states that do not see the world as you do, in order to create a better policy and better outcomes for people who are in conflict and difficulty.
Yeah, and if we look at the conflict in Ukraine, Russia's invasion, it's now nearly a half years old, and I see that President Zelensky appears now to be inviting the Russians to talk without preconditions. I'm wondering what Keir Starmer's government, what David Lammy as Foreign Secretary might do differently from the former policy of Boris Johnson and then, of course, our former Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron.
The Labour Party seemed to me to have been very clear with President Zelensky that a steadfast approach to Ukraine and support for Ukraine is absolutely at the top of their agenda. And again, they've written, above all else, standing by Ukraine is important to them. And whereas everyone wants to see an end to this conflict, I don't think there's a cigarette paper between the Labour Party's policy in standing absolutely steadfast with Ukraine and not giving the impression that there's any weakness or wavering there, and giving full support to President Zelensky in the belief that that is the best way to bring this to an end, by showing the resolution of the West, and that President Putin cannot break that down. So I think they have made it very clear. I understand that Keir Starmer had a telephone call with President Biden today and spoke about steadfast commitment and the press release says, the word unwavering was used. So I think in relation to policy on Ukraine, my sense is it will be very similar to that of the United Kingdom, the previous government of the United Kingdom, and that states are working together to support Ukraine to see an end to this conflict by standing up to Putin's aggression.
Yeah. And what about more broadly relations with what is often described as the global south? So those countries in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and of course Africa. Well, some people even put China in the global south, don't they, Alistair? How do you think we need to pivot from global Britain, Boris Johnson, and then what followed from him? Because it didn't seem necessarily to be that global. I mean, there was much more of a concern about people coming into the country as opposed to us reaching out to the rest of the world, forging better relations, and, of course, trading more.
Yeah. All I know of David Lammy from talking to him, and I don't claim to be a close confidant in any way, but spoken to him in the past and reading his writings, he feels the global south issues very, very, very acutely. Not surprisingly, he is the first foreign secretary of his background, and he feels that relationship very closely. And he uses two examples: the example of climate change, which of course impact hugely on
Actually,
the global
let me stop you
south.
for a second, Alistair, because some of our listeners are going to say, hang on, is Alistair right? Because James Cleverly is of, is mixed British and Sierra Leonean background. But are you talking about David Lammy being of Guyanese, so Caribbean heritage? Is that what you meant?
He is, and
Yes.
he's made that clear. And
Yes.
James indeed brought something very different to the Foreign Office, which was very positive. After a run of quite interesting foreign secretaries, I think James cleverly did a terrific job, as has David Cameron following him. But David Lammy is, I think, a particular individual to take on this role. And you look at his background in North London and what he says about his own origins and his own links. And he's made it clear that the Global South really matters to him. And he's done extensive travelling. He's spoken to a lot of people about the issues. But I was going on to say that he picked out two issues: climate change, which impacts the Global South a great deal, and what was widely believed to be a policy of hoarding vaccines in the West in relation to the COVID crisis. And these were things that impacted on the Global South. And I think that had an impact on David Lammy. I think he will look to see the United Kingdom moving to be more of a champion of common interests with the South, because he recognises that if the Global South is not in tune with what are believed to be the interests of the United Kingdom, this has a genuine impact. He points to the lack of votes on occasions at the UN on the Ukraine issue, for example, where not everyone sees the Ukraine issue quite as we do. We need allies and we need friends. And I think that one of the things he wants to do is pitch for those friendships and and that support, because I think he's seen UK foreign policy as not addressing that in the past, because it comes from what he's described in his writings as a nostalgic approach by the Conservative administration. Now, having been part of that, I don't necessarily agree with every part of his argument, but certainly I think he will make the Global South a focus for his interest, and he will see it in relation to how does this build alliances for the United Kingdom, which we all want to see. And I don't think he'll put China quite in that bracket.
Yeah.
He sees China quite clear-eyed, as the rest of us do.
Sure. Alistair, before we let you go, quick reflection on this catastrophic night for the Conservative Party. Quite a number of big beasts have been felled. And Nigel Farage wants to smash the rest of the party or take it over. What are your reflections at this point when you look at the debris where your party once stood?
I'm disappointed for some of my colleagues who have fallen. Having lost my seat myself some years ago in the 1997 Tony Blair landslide, I don't envy any colleague who lost their seat. It hurts, and that's very painful. But I do see our democratic process as one of enormous importance, in that it does provide an opportunity to draw a line for the country. This was always going to be, I had argued over 2 years ago that this was like 97, it wasn't 92. This was going to be a change election. It was an opportunity for the country, for a whole series of reasons, which I'm sure people have gone into over the last 24 hours, to say we're putting this behind us. They wanted the Conservative Party to go, and our system exaggerates both success and failure.
Yeah.
And that's what we saw. Now, in 2019, the Labour Party felt they'd never be in office again. So it can all change. It's all fragile. And although Keir Starmer has a very good majority, he'll be able to carry through Parliament what he wishes, it's all fragile and it can go quite quickly. The lesson for the Conservative Party, I'm quite sure, is to recognise power is held in the centre. If you're on the extremes, people aren't going to vote for you. If you fight amongst yourselves, people aren't going to vote for you. They should look to become a progressive party, and look to find good answers for the future. They fought a very negative campaign, and an overly defensive campaign. But in the end, they didn't have enough to go on. It's not wrong that the Conservative Party has lost office. This happens. And I think personally it was right that there is a change. But what now has to happen is there has to be a good centre-right party developing, and the Conservative Party has a responsibility. If it doesn't do it, somebody else will come along and pick off its voters. It mustn't kowtow to Nigel Farage's ambitions. He only wants to destroy the Conservative Party. That way lies ruin. And I think we should look to those people who will position the Conservative Party where the public wants it to be, and I don't think the public wants it to go down a rabbit hole. That's my view.
Alistair, that was really interestingly put. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Alistair Burt, former Conservative MP, a former Foreign Office Minister as well.